So you'll recall that I had promised to sort books by whether I had acquired them in the ARC retail outlet in Farmington, New Mexico, or not. And I'm going to limit that sorting project to art books, books that largely, although they may contain text, are largely serve the function of the displaying of either photographs or of photographs of works of art, whether those works of art are paintings, sculpture, stacked stones, or installations, or otherwise. And you'll also recall that the project of sorting these volumes, these texts, these books, by whether they had been acquired in ARC, this ARC retail outlet or not, began with a discussion of Provision 14C under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this provision allows individuals. Now, I don't actually recall how the discussion of this provision began. I think it began because I was addressing a certain amount of praise that had been given to Goodwill Industries and their success as a business and their success in providing individuals with disabilities training and employment. And I had objected to the unqualified praise on the grounds that my experience in working with Goodwill, and I worked there less than a year, but my experience working there was that many of the individuals employed within Goodwill itself were provided with wages that were sub-minimum wage, and that were based on this provision 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the justification for this is the first volume that we found that I definitively remember acquiring at ARC, and you'll also recall that most of these volumes were at that time entirely for free. That ARC was giving away the books that were donated to them entirely for free. And one of the reasons for that might have been, well, Farmington isn't a particularly literary town. In fact, I don't think there's a single bookstore that devoted to the sale of only books in the entire town of Farmington, New Mexico, which is a reasonably large population. But you can acquire books at many of these used stores or thrift stores or other sort of stores. There are two Walmarts, and both of them include a small selection of books, but hardly what you would call hardly constitute what you would define as a bookstore per se. And that might be one of the reasons why these volumes were given away for free at that time. So in terms of the other, let's see, I have to decide how I'm going to do this. In terms of provision 14C of the Fair Labor Standard Act and goodwill, my experience was that utilizing goodwill as a model, for progressive labor practice, one would have to be ignorant of this practice of paying individuals, sub-minimum wage, or one would have to have a definition of success in working with individuals with disabilities that, wasn't my definition. And I believe I had called attention to the fact that these wages were determined using time motion studies, and there was a model, and I don't know how entirely that model was derived by goodwill, but there was a model norm of how many pieces in this piecework, whether it was sorting clothing onto racks, by size and size and type of clothing, pants and shirts go here and jackets go there, or whether it was unloading, or whether it was receiving, but whatever it was, they would have a norm for how much was supposed to be done, and then these individuals working for the program would be evaluated according to what percentage of that norm their work accomplished, and then Paul Klee, one of my favorite painters. I personally really like flat painting style. My painting is somewhat flat, not as flat as Klee, and I tend to like. I also tend to like this kind of modeling, and I rarely do it. I should do it, more often when I do paint, because I like the aged look and feel of it, even though it's not, but but it's produced with that feel of time and disintegration, and these characteristics of layering and dissolve. So if I ever get back to painting, I'll spend more time with that. I didn't. This was one of my mother's books that I acquired after she passed away, and that I moved into her home in Santa Fe briefly with Lori, and I were there for less than a year. So let's see. These are old. This is interesting. These are old photos. This is a photo of Lori, and this was a painting that I had done of Lori, and then I no longer have the painting, but I took a photograph of the painting, and then I processed the photograph using some kind of an application, maybe Adobe Photoshop or something like that. I used to have a lot of different processes of the painting in addition to the painting itself, but over the course of losing material goods in so many different ways, I've lost all of that. It's somewhat of a miracle that I even have this one. Should probably, because I wasn't aware that it was in this volume, relocate these to a different place. So put these up here for the time being. I'm fairly certain, I don't know why I opened this volume, but I'm fairly certain that maybe I did acquire this at ARC. So anyway, these time motion studies would provide a new model, for a rate of pay, and then individuals in Goodwill would be paid that rate. And then we're sorting by ARC. ARC also runs a program out of Santa Rosa, where I was for a while, although I didn't have a working relationship with the ARC program there. But I was hired for another program, and that program also used Provision 14C to interesting text, very problematic. That place also used. Oh, that's beautiful. Reminds me of those textured areas in the way that Jasper John works in a certain way. This representation of these logs. Interesting. And I was hired there, although I never started work there, because I was dismayed by the the industrial situation, in which individuals with developmental disabilities were employed and paid under this provision, less than minimum wage, and I didn't really want to have much to do with the program, although they liked my resume and my work, which included a lot of my artwork, and included descriptions of individuals I'd worked with in other areas. I've actually worked with on sort of both ends as a teacher and as a subject of instruction with individuals in various what you call it, health applications of art making, in different institutional settings. And I've experienced art therapists and the way that they work that really have had quite a wide range of abilities. I remember one art therapist in one mental health institution, hospital. I think it was Metropolitan. It may have been Bellevue Hospital in New York. I'm not sure, but this particular art therapist, this individual, would sort of open up the room and throw down coloring books and various sorts of sort of ready-made grade school, grammar school time occupiers, and that was his idea of art therapy. And then there was the more standard one that would provide materials like glitter and yarn and glue and different kinds of paste and different kinds of baubles and trinkets, and you would do this craft project. Well, that was a little better, but not too much, right? So you could do expressive work in different ways. The only really good one was an art therapist at Metropolitan, and one of the ways that I had gotten into Metropolitan to begin with was I had you have to have some excuse for getting into the hospital if you're gonna spend time within that particular positionality as a labeled subject, right, of psychiatric treatment. So one of the methods that I had for getting in was I had burned my arm, and it was quite a significant burn, and that's going to get you admitted to mental health ward within a hospital setting pretty quickly. So I had this burn, and my idea for working in art therapy there was to work with the burn. So I would draw pictures of the burn as it healed, and the bandages, and the removal of the bandages. And at one point, this art therapist took me aside and looked at the work, and he really engaged what I was doing, but it was interesting. He also warned me. He said, "Don't show this to anyone else, what you're doing here, because they'll take it as obsessive and a sign of derangement." And it's like, and he said, "I see what you're doing. I see the way that you're performing this work as an act of healing and integrating and exploring trauma and self-harm and all these different issues." But he was very insistent on this idea, but don't show anyone else. He also had he had done these beautiful drawings of raindrops. I can't draw myself, so I had really admire individuals who can draw like this. But he had drawn these raindrops on glass, on windows, and viewing these. This is all Ansel Adams. Interesting. And I really admired, his, both his work and his ability to, conceive of what I was doing as an individual and the processes that I was involved in, and his acceptance of that, and his advice. And I remember him saying something about he had this image. It was almost like a poem, and this metaphor of being in a storm, and one can be affected by the storm and take on the turbulence of the storm, or one can be like the mountain. The mountain weathers the storm but isn't affected by it. And I think this was his model for a kind of meditative artwork, is to be within the storm, but to be the mountain, and you didn't find art therapists like that in these various institutions that I had explored very often. In fact, I think he was the only one. But he was probably one of the reasons that I wanted to seek a position as an art therapist, or someone working with individuals, using creative arts as a means of exploring personal identity and development in these different areas, and to occupy this position as opposed to the position of observing as a student and as a subject located inside the institution in a different way. So this place that I applied to, that I actually received, an offer for a position, but then I turned it down, was in Santa Rosa, and it was a kind of work and community outreach center there, and I won't say that it was the organization called Becoming Independent, but looking at the web this morning and recalling this particular center, I will say that the center that I applied to for work and but ultimately failed to take the position for, looked a lot like the center called Becoming Independent in Santa Rosa. The architecture and the area strikingly. So I will say that, and I will say that the reason that I rejected the position when it was offered to me was I was appalled by the fact that not only were individuals in this work program that they had under the domain of art, not only were they doing piecework, disassembling pieces of mechanical materials, and things like heat sinks and electronic parts and bits, and not only were they doing it for sub-minimum wage rates, but they were largely isolated, and the field was very industrial. And of course, as I was going through and they were introducing me to some of the individuals that they had in the programs there and who I might be working with, these individuals were, very, starved for attention, starved for social attention, and very eager to put down their work and talk to me. But I was, very much aware that this wasn't, meaningful and productive labor or meaningful and productive social activity of any kind. And minimally, if one is receiving less than substandard wages, one should be engaged in an activity where one can at least have a conversation with one's peers and enjoy, being in this work, which I have to, grant, in the case of individuals working for goodwill, at least, the work environment wasn't isolating and disturbingly mechanical, the way that it was in this center that very much reminded me of what I saw on the web this morning on a site labeled as belonging to the program of Becoming Independent. This beautiful image. I love those layers. These layers remind me of, but of course they're much more beautiful, but they remind me of another art project that I had attempted to, initially acquire. This was, again, back in the 80s. One of the ways that I liked working, as an artist was indirectly as an artist. So talking about my experience with this community center that resembles becoming independent, or talking about my experiences in Metropolitan Hospital working with art therapists, or in Bellevue Hospital working with art therapists, was my way of doing art. It was very much indirect, and it still involved a certain amount of drawing or making, or I was really drawing those wounds that I had, self-inflicted, as a means of getting there. And I was really writing about them, and I was making stuff, but the larger project was the performance around those makings. And one early attempt at a situated model, for making art at the boundaries of making art, was an attempt that I had made to acquire a position in this gallery in San Diego, near the Gaslamp District. This was in the early 80s, and the Gaslamp District was undergoing gentrification. A lot of people were getting moved around. And one of the things that displaced some of the real art communities was this gallery where they sold these expensive, high-priced posters of very flat, but not in a good way, designs. And one of these designs I remember being like sunrises or sunsets, these mountain ridges, with different tones and variations in these kind of misty backgrounds, and these were posters. They weren't original works of art, but they were prints, and you could sell these. So I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting as a performance art piece, to become a salesman of this really bad but expensive art in this space that had been gentrified and moved and displaced a lot of struggling artists, including a lot of performance artists. Sushi, survived this gentrification for a number of years. Not there anymore, but it survived for a number of years. But a lot of the smaller venues for performance artists didn't survive gentrification. So I thought, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-inhabit, this, sort of middle class space of non-art that passes itself off as high art or whatever it does. And that was one of the first attempts to do one of these types of projects. And the reason that attempt failed, so the reason that my attempt to do this piece at this place that very much reminds me of becoming independent, was that I didn't like the way that individuals with disabilities were being treated, and I didn't want to be part of that project, that project of because at that point my motto was more being a good art therapist than it was being this sort of ironic parodist, but in relationship to what was going on in San Diego in the early 80s, I didn't at all mind selling these horrible works to those individuals that cared to decorate their homes with this idea of art. So and sort of at the expense of real artists in a certain way, who, like I said, had been displaced through these various acts of gentrification. So that was the project, and the reason that one failed was entirely different reasons for my refusal to become involved in this other venture. It was because in order to sell these works of art that, like I say, like this vaguely reminds me of, but is much more beautiful and much more detailed than, but one had to purchase the portfolio, right? So I think it was either like $500 or $1,000 to purchase this portfolio, and then you use their space to resell your portfolio. And they liked that I was an art student at UCSD and all of that. And they, it's not, it wasn't even really about being hired. It was about like being young and attractive enough, like, to sell to people who didn't know anything about art, and with money that you had invested. So there was no like potential loss for them, because once you had invested the money in the portfolio, and honestly, $500 at that time, or $1,000 or whatever it was quite a sum of money. I certainly didn't have it, so I didn't have the money to invest in that project, although I think it would have been an interesting performance piece if I had had the resources. I could have gotten a grant, but getting a grant for that kind of performance work is difficult, because you have to get them to understand the social ramifications of why you're doing the work, and what displacement is, and what gentrification is, and it's a lot of work to do. And then they start to like question what your motives are, and whether that the very work that you're doing, undermines of what their notion of art might be to begin with, and it's raising problems. So anyway, so that's the story that begins this particular sorting project. This is another one. My mother used to like to write her name in all of her books, particularly the books that she thought were valuable. She was a teacher, and she was a little paranoid about losing her materials. I don't know that writing your name in a book is really going to ensure that someone doesn't take it, but I think that was her idea. And this very profound sense of ownership and property that she had, that I don't believe that she was in a situation like I was over the course of time, where she had many instances of losing everything that she owned. Property was more stable for her in a certain sense, and ownership wasn't as problematic for her. She really liked Kandinsky. I have several Kandinsky stories, but I don't have time to tell them here. Those stories belong to a different set of sorting. So you can tell that this one, by the inscription, was acquired in a second-hand store, and I like Giotto because it's still flat, but not quite flat enough for my taste. I prefer the icons that precede him. So since we're sorting art books and some of this art, is the kind of art that would be housed in the space of a museum. I'll tell another sort of anecdotal story that doesn't involve ARC or Goodwill, but involves some clients at a day program that my wife worked in Oceanside, California, and called Terry. And Terry also had a really good art program, actually. Nothing like the one I described in this other location, but this story involves the space of the museum, and not this kind of art, but a different kind of art and a different kind of historical and archaeological housing. Again, you can see, I knew this was my mother's book because it's Paul Clay, but there's the name again. But this story takes place in the San Luis Rey mission in Oceanside, California, and I was volunteering there as a kind of amateur historian of the mission, and it's interesting, the kinds of books that you find in used bookstores. And so I was volunteering at the mission, and I had done work for the San Luis Rey Band, involving preparations and the conducting of the powwows that they host there in the summer, and and I was at the mission. I was a greeter at the old chapel, and I would give information about the old chapel and how it was built and who built it and its history, and the reason that I did that was because of Paulo talk and wanting to disseminate certain narrative truth that often got overlooked by some of the other amateur greeters, and sort of wanting to make sure that history got told. So that was also a performance function as storyteller, and I would tell people about the history of the missions and of Native Americans, and how Native Americans were used as labor, and I would talk about the history of the Luiseno Native Americans in the area, and the various missions, and actually, this book was, part of the research. I didn't mention, but this book was actually, this one, which isn't going to get sorted into the materials that I acquired at ARC in Farmington, was part of the research for my work at the Mission San Luis Rey. So that's why I was there, and the work that I was doing there, as storyteller and historian in a certain way, and corrective historian, to make sure that the parts of the story that might otherwise be overlooked, got told, and some of my wife didn't have this particular group of clients at the time, but some of Lori's ex-clients, showed up at the museum, which is and store, which is part of that old mission now, and they recognized me. I had worked with them, in various ways, and I used to, help Lori occasionally, and on holidays like Thanksgiving, I would, make vegetarian and vegan dishes and bring them over for their celebration. They really liked my my Southwest style bean rice, potato and squash lasagna, which is delicious. So it's understandable why they liked it so much, and they recognized me and got excited by the fact that I was working there, and they were there for the purpose of going and looking at this museum, and one of the clients, I won't give anybody's name, but I refer to her as W. So W, in looking at the museum, began reading rather loudly all of the sort of anthropological and archaeological plaques and the information provided, and like I said, loudly. She would go from one piece to another and read the descriptors, and she read them really, quite exuberantly and quite well, I thought, and surprised me in a certain sense. And I was really enjoying the entire performance of her reading in this archaeological and anthropological space provided in the setting of this larger institution of the mission. And but I noticed that that everyone else who worked there, I wish I could say that I had found this at ARC, but I don't believe it. That is not beautiful. You can't really see, but this textured image, like, actually You can't really see it, but it gives the appearance of being in motion. But they were extremely, uncomfortable with the performance in the museum space, right? So the museum space was, these things were to be read, but read in silence, I suppose. And the museum space was clearly, for them, not a space of performance and performativity, not a space of theater, but a space of silent engagement and contemplation. So perhaps, more like the museum as temple, or the museum as library, and one, would hush someone, who violated the sanctity. I remember in France, when you would go to visit Notre Dame, they had a running tape recording in French of this very deep masculine voice saying, "Silence, silence, vous êtes dans la grande église de Notre Dame," and this booming, tape recorded, patriarchal male voice would silence you, and remind you of the sanctity of this church space. So these individual, this W, was performing loudly and enthusiastically, a reading of all of the information for each one of the pieces, one at a time. Much to my amusement, but much to the despair of of the others, guarding the sanctity of this museum space that had been created within this mission space. And it was one of my, I've seen other performances in museums and galleries, and I've seen museums and galleries act as theatrical or performance spaces, and I've seen this in high art arenas and in more makeshift arenas, but I've never seen a performance by a professional artist that challenged. Oh, I was going to put that there because I so want to, but I don't believe that that's an ARC book. I've never seen a professional performance that challenged the disparity, between, this type of silent artifactual observing and improvisatory and challenging social engagement that W's performance managed to produce. And that remains, for me, one of the most engaging and significant, theatrical pieces. This is another really fantastic book. I wish I could sort this into the ARC books, but as you can see, by my mother's claim, it was not acquired at ARC. But W's performance, like I said, and others will could argue that, well, that wasn't really a performance, that was just her way of being in the world. And I would agree that that was her way of being in the world. But for me, of course, that doesn't exclude the fact that it was performance, and its being a performance is largely a function of the way that one takes it. So the anxiety that that the other attendants of this particular performance were experiencing suggest this as well, right? That they weren't experiencing it as theater. They were experiencing it as a disruption of the. So again, here's another example of the kinds of things that you find in a used book, that you don't get when you buy something firsthand, and that give clues as to where something might have been acquired. But they were experiencing it as a violation, of the institution, and I was as well, but I was in an entirely different way. I mean, the challenge to the assumptions of silence and the assumptions of the museum. Oh, that's lovely. The assumptions of the museum space as a place to see but not to be seen, not to be heard, and the way that W's performance not only challenged the assumptions of that, but challenged the assumptions that ableist assumptions, and those who serve as the guardians, in a certain sense, of those assumptions, right? Always demand the silence, in particular of individuals with disabilities, that it brought those two silences together in a way that that I found to be enlightening, and not only as a sort of meta artistic or meta dramatic rendering of the assumptions of museum space, but of a kind of maybe it wasn't entirely conscious on her part, but a kind of like rejection of the authority that ordinary individuals will assume that they have to silence individuals with disabilities. And and in part that Laurie's work with this group fostered that challenge of being silenced, before then. This one, obviously, well, not obviously, but I acquired this, in Santa Fe, either at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum or somewhere nearby. And so to me, it was both, it was political in two ways. It was political in terms of addressing the assumptions of museum space, but it was also political in terms of addressing the assumptions that people have regarding the silencing of individuals with disabilities. And that particular conjunction I found extraordinarily powerful, and has to remain one of my favorite this is another one. Nice. Wish we could put this in there as well in our arc, but we can't. I remember buying this elsewhere. And the other thing, that I really liked about, W's, performance in the museum is that in spite of the fact that, it produced all of this anxiety and created the kind of disturbance that I like, in actions and situationist work. Nobody really could get in trouble, because W, was, clearly had every right to be there, and she had a legitimate excuse for this performance, right? It was her embodiment as a particular kind of cognitive subject, and even though the guardians of the institution would have liked to have silenced her within this context, they were also uncomfortable in performing that act of guardianship. And so I liked the way that the space could be disrupted, but the authorities that had possession, of the opportunity to do something about that disruption, were also interrupted in their ability to perform the obligatory silencing. And so W's, we're getting into trouble here. So W's performance, which was, entirely unauthorized. Nevertheless, took place within a certain amount of security. This is obviously, you know, a used book as well, and acquired in another used bookstore. But I can tell by the sticky note and the attention to detail that this is not a book that that I received freely at ARC. So let's see how this works. 17, you know, sometimes we receive numbers. Let's see what 17 gives us. You have to trust the numbers. If you don't trust the numbers, you never find the space-time coordinates that that are so entirely relevant to you.